As a best-selling global author, what are your views on this current age we're living in? Is fact really stranger than fiction today?
What a great question, and I fully agree with you. I mean, there are so many moments when people feel like the life we're living is almost surreal, isn't it? It's full of uncertainties. Of course, with the pandemic, that feeling has aggravated in a way. We're living in the age of anxiety. I think it's like an existential angst. We're living in the age of anger, fear, frustration, but also we're living in the age of change, and we know that change is possible. So it's a very interesting moment, like in-betweenness, I call it. The old world is no more, but the new world is not born yet, and we are in the middle. And that is a difficult place to be in because it's full of uncertainty. And I think at a moment like this, we need global solidarity, we need global sisterhood, but we especially need books, words, stories, empathy, connections. We should not be drawn into artificial tribes of nationalism or any other fundamentalism. We need to connect across borders.
Fantastic. And you did mention some political themes there. So I'd just like to know, how do social and political events in your life and in your home country, Turkey, influence your writing? In what ways do you use literature as a way to deal with the ever-changing uncertainty of our times, especially when it comes to Turkey?
Yes, literature is where my heart beats, you know. It's how I breathe. It's how I connect with the world. It's how I perceive everything around me. So for me, it's at the heart of everything. Stories. And I describe myself as a storyteller. But that said, my storytelling is a curious storytelling in the sense that I am a curious person. And I think we all are, aren't we? So I learn from different disciplines. So I learn from life. But basically, I think as a writer coming from a wounded democracy or a wobbly democracy, countries like Turkey or Pakistan or Venezuela or Brazil, but nowadays also Hungary, nowadays also Poland, the list is so long, and that list is getting longer, unfortunately. So if you happen to be a writer from wounded democracies, you do not have the luxury of saying, you know what, I'm not going to talk about what's happening outside the window. You don't have the luxury of saying, I only want to talk about fiction and nothing else. Because we writers are not disconnected from the societies where we come from. But also, I am a feminist. And I've learned many, many things from feminist movements of past generations. And one of the most fundamental things we have learned from early feminists was that politics is not only about political parties, it's not only about parliaments or politicians, what politicians do. Politics is broader than that. Wherever there's power, there is politics, which means you might be writing about sexuality, you might be writing about gender discrimination, you might be writing about women's issues, and you might still be doing political work. So if you describe politics in such a broad way, again, you cannot be apolitical or non-political. But that said, for me, there's a very important nuance. I'm interested in asking questions. As a writer, I don't try to give any answers. I don't know the answers myself. We're learning, all of us, together. But I think a writer's job is to create an open space where we can talk about difficult issues, including taboos, and try to give more voice to the voiceless, and try to give more power to the disempowered. So for me, rather than looking at the center, I'd rather look at the periphery and try to see who are the ones who are forgotten, silenced, and forsaken today.
Now, in your own words as a writer, as an intellectual and as an outspoken activist, what does freedom of speech mean to you personally? And how can we communicate to people around the world how crucially important it truly is, not only for our democracies, but also to the human condition itself?
Yes, I fully agree. And you put it so beautifully, because without freedom of speech, we can't have any chance for imagination, for literature, thinking and advance, progress. It's impossible if there is no freedom of speech. That's the oxygen we need in order to exist. So I wholeheartedly believe that democracies do not only survive with a ballot box. You know, democracies do not only survive with elections. Turkey has elections, relatively speaking, regular elections. It's not a democracy. Russia has elections, but it's not a democracy. So clearly, I respect the ballot box enormously, but all I'm saying is, in addition to the ballot box, we need other things in order to make that system a proper democracy. What do we need? We need rule of law. So important. Separation of powers. No human being, no political party in this world should be too powerful. It is not good. We need, as human beings, we need to correct each other. So separation of powers is very important. But we need a free media, diverse media. We need women's rights, minority rights, LGBT plus rights, and we need freedom of speech. Together with all these components and the ballot box, a democracy can survive. If the components are broken, that system cannot be a democracy. It can only be majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism.
Let's now turn our focus to minorities and oppressed populations. First of all, you are an outspoken women's rights activist. In your personal view, where are women globally today? How far are we as a global community away from achieving true equality of the genders?
I think we're at a very critical crossroads, and it would be a huge mistake to assume that women's rights is the problem of some people far away over there in some turbulent lands, but it's not a problem in the Western world because the Western world is so beyond that threshold. That would be a huge mistake. And I think if we've learned anything at all from the events of these past years, especially after 2016, Brexit happened, Trump's election happened, we have seen the rise of populist movements in country after country. So when you look at that entire framework, if we have learned anything at all, we've learned that there's no such thing as solid countries versus liquid countries. We're all living in liquid times, East or West, which means democracy is much more fragile than we initially assumed. It's a very delicate ecosystem of checks and balances. And when and if countries go backwards, as it happened in Turkey, as it happened in many other parts of the world too, unfortunately, if and when countries tumble into ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, populist authoritarianism, the first things that will be curbed, taken away, will be women's rights and minority rights.
In addition to fighting for women's rights, you are also an active and passionate advocate of the LGBT plus community worldwide. Can you tell us what challenges gays, lesbians, transgender individuals, and many others face today, and what you are doing yourself to combat such hate and prejudice?
There are many challenges, and it would maybe I should also mention that some of these challenges are very open and visible, but some others are more subtle, maybe a little bit more diffused, discrimination, inequality. And we need to increase our awareness to understand, and we need to listen to each other's stories. We definitely need to listen to the stories of LGBTQ plus communities, because there are so many stories that are being untold and unheard, even to this day. Sometimes it's more difficult to challenge a discrimination that is more subtle or internalized, all these prejudices. But I think it's very, very crucial if we want to have proper equality and human dignity. For me, I think anyone who looks at my own writing, you know, over the years in almost all of my books, from the very beginning, actually, my novels, also my interviews, my academic background in gender and women's studies, queer studies, it's very clear that I have, in my own way, you know, always tried to defend the rights of LGBTQ plus community. But I think I never had the courage to say that it was a much more emotional connection for me, not only a cerebral one, not only an intellectual one. It took me many years to be able to come forward and say that I was bisexual. I felt, I think, never ready to say that until recently. But all I'm trying to say, and the reason why I mentioned this, is because I believe each and every human being is, you know, has multitudes inside, like the poet Walt Whitman used to say. We all have multitudes inside, but we are living in a world that does not celebrate or understand multiplicity, and we're constantly being reduced down to narrow identities or just threads of identities. I want to be able to celebrate multiplicity. For me, one way of doing that is literature.
So, what should we do as an international community when it comes to big shifts like Poland introducing gay-free zones, whatever that is, or Turkey cracking down year upon year upon year on LGBTQ plus marches in Istanbul and elsewhere? Should we just say, well, those countries, they're on their own journey, they'll get there, we have to let them reign free and figure things out for themselves? Or should we, as a global community, say, enough is enough?
I think, first of all, we need to stop seeing these incidents as isolated incidents. There is a backlash against minority rights. There's a backlash against progress, against women's rights. Why? Because the world is changing. Because people can see that change is happening. More and more people are coming forward and defending equality, justice for all, basic human dignity for all. And this is creating a backlash as well. So we need to understand that we all have to speak up and speak out. Human rights are universal. It is not something that every country can negotiate on their own or every government can decide on their own. I'm talking about basic human dignity and equality. This is a universal value that we all need to defend. And therefore, I find it very important that human rights be at the forefront of all of our talks. If politicians are using human rights as a secondary issue, as something that can be put on the back burner in the name of commercial interests, in the name of financial interests, what does that say about us, about Europe, about core European values? So we can't allow that to happen. I think human rights has to be at the center of all of our relations. I find it completely unacceptable, unthinkable what's happening in Poland today, creating these so-called LGBTQ plus free zones. What's happening in Turkey today, and for many years it has been going on, also in Brazil, but also in many other parts of the world. So for me, it's a huge part of the struggle for democracy, diversity, and inclusion to defend the rights of the LGBTQ plus community.
And finally, as a last question in this interview series, I would just like to ask you, what are your next projects? Can you give us a glimpse of what you're working on at the moment and what your audiences around the world can look forward to?
I can answer this question now. Maybe if we had spoken a week ago or a month ago, I might have struggled more because I've been writing completely withdrawn for a very long time. Only yesterday I finished my new novel and handed it to my editor. It's with the copy editing and everything. It will be published this summer in August in the UK. It's called The Island of Missing Trees. And it's the story of two islands, Cyprus and UK. It's a story that has family traumas, memory, amnesia, storytelling, the things that we cannot talk about easily in our own families. It's a love story at its heart, but I think it's also a story in which trees and environment, and especially one particular fig tree, plays a huge role. So in a way, the fig tree tells the story.